Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Halftime Talk feature interview. And I'm delighted today to be joined by Simon Mabon, who is Professor of International Politics at Lancaster University, Director of Sectarianism, Proxies and Desectarianisation Project, and also Director of the Richardson Institute at the university. So thank you for joining us, Simon, and for taking the time to speak to us today. We will be talking about regional politics and everything that weaves into that, given your specialization. I'd like to start by talking about, sort of looking at a big picture, sort of balance of power in the region. In the Gulf, let's talk about the Gulf specifically, because that is where the power lies and has done so in terms of monetary power for a few decades. Bigger picture impression from you on these tectonic shifts that we're seeing really having taken place the last few years. What's your take on that? How deep is that shift going to be, and how is it going to impact the power balance going forward?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you today. That really is the big picture question, isn't it? And I'm afraid I'm going to give you a slight cop-out answer, which is I fear it's too soon to tell. If you'd have been asking me or my equivalent in 2003 with the US invasion of Iraq, they would perhaps have speculated that this is also a seismic moment that reveals the shifting tectonic plates. Similarly, in 2011 with the Arab uprisings, similarly, perhaps even with the US assassination of Qasem Soleimani at the start of 2020, hinting at a potentially seismic shift. But I think what we're seeing right now bears the hallmarks of something more serious. We're seeing a number of different moving parts, a number of different things coming together to create a particularly precarious environment for global and indeed regional politics. And it's in those precarious moments where change takes place, right? It's in those moments where actors with interests and with aspirations start to maneuver. And so, leaving aside the US-Russian aspect and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, those shifts at the international stage open up possibilities at the regional stage. And I guess there's some of the things that we'll be getting onto in the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll definitely get on to, obviously, Russia, Ukraine, and how that's impacting this region and this region's outlook on that. Let's talk a little bit about something that has been obviously clearly shifting in the last year or two, which is the US engagement, or intentional, at least intentions for engagement in the region. We saw the withdrawal of Afghanistan, which was not very well done, but nevertheless expected and planned, but more sort of focusing in on the GCC countries, which have, as we know, had a very positive historical relationship with the US for many decades. And yet we do have very open opinion from the GCC leaders that they're not happy with how the US is engaging with regards to its intentions to remain in the region, to be a security protector, in light of, especially in light of recent attacks in Saudi and the UAE by the Houthis, etc. A complicated equation, a complicated set of dynamics going on. But what is the US intentionally, in your opinion, withdrawing from the region? Is that going to happen really, or at the end of the day, it's the only country that can provide that security and will remain engaged?
I think for now, we're going to see continued US engagement. There's been a lot of anger, resentment, frustration, tensions, pick your adjectives here, between the Gulf states and the US, dating back to the election of Barack Obama, 14 years ago or so now. And during the Obama presidency, there were a lot of tensions, a lot of concerns that he was reaching out to Iran, that he was soft on Iran, that he was pulling the US out of the region, that he was putting human rights above realpolitik. And so there was a lot of concern there. Now, of course, under Donald Trump, viewed as a more transactional type of president, someone that Gulf leaders thought they could do business with, things became a little bit more positive. There was someone who would understand where they were coming from. Tough on Iran, of course, pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, and less concerned with the fluffy issues of human rights. But now, of course, President Biden has reopened those dialogues with Iran. is coming down incredibly hard on human rights issues across the Gulf, from the Saudis to somewhere as small as Bahrain, is putting quite a bit of pressure on. Now, the extent to which those states are listening to President Biden, I think, is a really interesting question. In the past, of course, given the US influence in the region, they would have listened because they would have been left with little option. The US was their guarantor, their security guarantor. But now, speaking to friends and colleagues, there's who are in the region, there's a sense that the US doesn't hold the same level of influence. They're not as reliant on the US for security because they don't believe they can trust the US. And it may be that that level of trust isn't warranted, or that distrust isn't warranted, and that Washington would have the backs of Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, etc. But I think one of the things that we're seeing is that that level of concern is prompting this realignment with Israel, the Abraham Accords, vis-a-vis Iran, this opening up of trade, these new areas, these new avenues and possibilities with the Israelis, because of a concern at Washington's future in the region. So yeah, I think there's a lot of questions.
Yeah, and certainly Washington hasn't minced words about saying, you guys now get on with it. We're still there, but you need to sort out your problems, whether it's a détente with Israel or with, and even the Iranians and the other Gulf states trying to figure things out. Let's talk about it from the GCC angle again as well. I mean, the US has its reasons for withdrawing. It's also more energy independent, and that's probably why it's a bit more relaxed about all of this going forward. How does that impact the GCC's approach to China, to Russia? Let's not talk about Ukraine for now. We'll talk about that a bit later. But in terms of who are my secure future partners if I'm a GCC oil producer? Is it America, or am I going to compromise certain things and go with the old, with more reliable, predictable, perhaps? There's faults there in other ways, but should I be putting all my eggs with the East, basically?
I think that's the big question that policymakers, particularly in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, are trying to get to grips with. They know that they can deal with China. They have been dealing with China, and the dealing with China is relatively risk-free, and perhaps more importantly, it's untied. It's not coming with a set of expectations and obligations with regard to human rights and political reform, because that's the Chinese business model, right? Untied aid and untied economic engagement, unlike Washington. And that's appealing for many. But there's the Iran question. There's the sense that China is working with a partner that many in the region view as the source of all evil. And that's, of course, a very ideological claim to make. But some in the region have that strong ideological vision and interpretation of Iran. Others would say, look, Iran is a perfectly pragmatic state that's engaging in some nefarious behavior, trying to secure its own future. And maybe we can talk a bit about Iran in a little bit, but the ongoing relationship between China and Iran, regardless of the view that you hold of Iran, is a concern, because it may well come to a point, and I don't think it will, I'm not in any way saying that it will, but if relations between the Arab Gulf states and Iran deteriorate further, then the Arab Gulf states don't want to be in a position where China is forced to choose.
Yeah, and at the same time, they're being a bit more forgiving towards China for having relations with Iran and continuing that, whereas they're much more critical when the US even tries to reach out. And again, in terms of this nuclear deal where we do have negotiations and talks right now, and they're much more sensitive about that to an extent. And let's talk a bit about that. Where that deal is in the context of the possibilities or the keenness to get it done. I mean, a lot of our commentators on the energy front would say we're not going to see a deal now before the midterm elections. Politically speaking, domestically, Biden can't get away with that in terms of doing a deal with Iran. Where do you think the US stands on that front, and what is its approach to Iran going forward?
So, talking to people who are either involved in or peripherally involved in the talks, there was a general belief that they were done, that the deal was made. And then there were concerns about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and Russian demands about trade between Moscow and Tehran being exempt from sanctions. And that was a stumbling block. And that is a major issue given Russia's prominent position in the P5, in the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, and as a consequence, in the negotiations with Iran. So now you've got an impasse within the group, the P5+1, who are supposed to be negotiating as a bloc with Iran. So that's a big issue. So as much as Biden may want to get the deal done, and he does, and so do people in London and elsewhere, there is that serious hurdle of Mr. Putin and his aspirations, either to be somewhat nefarious and thwart the deal, or to ensure that he's got a line of capital coming into the state from a newly emboldened Iranian economy. And I think for the Arab states, there's a lot of concern because Iran has just signed this huge deal with China. With some commentators speculatively saying that it could be worth somewhere in the region of $400 billion, which is huge. And at the same time, you've got China engaging with the Arab Gulf states in a far less ambitious way, far less aspirational way, but still pretty huge numbers. Chinese investment in the kingdom, the Saudi state, is somewhere in the region of $44 billion over a decade or so, I think. And in Iraq, it's going up dramatically. I would expect similar types of avenues to open up in Syria. So you've got, on the one hand, conservative engagement, conservative economic engagement with China from the Arab Gulf states, and then possible exponential risky engagement between Iran and China. So all of that is factored into both the Arab states' engagement and possible views on the deal, because the deal will open up huge possibilities for Iran, but also Washington's engagement with the deal and their views on the Arab states themselves.
Yeah, and of course, in the middle of that is nuclear weapons and
yeah.
where those are and where the intentions are. And let's talk a bit about those sort of overlapping interests, Simon. As you said, China and Iran have very strong, and that relationship is strengthening as the day goes by. And the Gulf, also the GCC Arab states, I don't think would think that's going to go away. And the Saudis themselves have been sitting at a table with the Iranians, with some intermediaries, obviously, because they want this deal. Obviously, they want peace in the region, by the sounds of it. But of course, they want security, and they want to be sure that there's no threat to them from that point of view. And of course, the US was initially the country that was securing that. But from an economic standpoint, let's just bring that sort of forward. That's obviously in the Saudis' interest. We're seeing Saudi obviously diversifying and opening up its economy even more away from oil, etc., and also trying to attract investment. How much do you think that pathway is influencing or will influence its take on the geopolitics between Iran and countries like China?
Well, it's huge. The economic component is absolutely central for Saudi Arabia. I mentioned earlier there are some who view Iran as this sort of bastion of evil. That's not MBS per se. It's not his close circle, because they have a particular hostile view towards Iran, I think, but they're also pragmatists. And they would argue that it's not in the Saudis' interest for there to be another war. The Yemen war is having a huge strain on the Saudi economy. And MBS, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, has sort of rested his whole future, he's staked his whole future on the implementation of Vision 2030 and the building of this huge city of the future, NEOM. And that's about economics. That's pure and simple economics, transforming the country away from its reliance on oil, projecting it as a city of the future, a city that can rival Abu Dhabi and Dubai as sites of tourism, economic investment, technological development. And so for the Saudis to go to war would involve putting that vision to one side. And I don't think MBS is ready to do that. There was a piece written by two of my PhD students, one from Iran and one from Saudi Arabia. It's one of maybe 2 or 3 pieces written by Saudi and Iranian scholars ever. And they both said the same types of things, that the Iranians, they just want to be able to have a better quality of life without hyperinflation, without soaring costs, without the devastation that's come from economic sanctions. And the Saudis want a pragmatic future where they can engage with other states, trade, and transform their country away from this reliance on oil. So pragmatically, there is this desire to do it. Now, the question is what happens when the Houthis start launching missiles? And that's where I think the talks between the Saudis and the Iranians start to come into friction, because the Saudis want the Iranians to be able to say, we will stop the Houthis. And I don't know to what extent the Iranians are able, not necessarily willing, but able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's one of their weapons, isn't it, in terms of getting the attention of the US in terms of a sanctions point of view. And as soon as these economic sanctions are lifted off Iran, which has been under them for decades, then it's, presumably it would sort of relax its proxy weapons, if you like. Let's talk a bit about the GCC cohesion then on the economic front. Competitively, you mentioned Saudi's aspirations. Clearly, it's always the largest economy in the region anyway. In the Gulf, Iran, massive economy, which once the chains are released will obviously be positive for it and for its neighbors. So in terms of that sort of common block, if you like, aspirations, do you think that is obviously pushing the equation? And also, but then what about the competition? You mentioned Saudi is going to be rivaling Dubai and Abu Dhabi in terms of its tourism and openness to the outside world. Is there space for everybody?
I guess that's the other $1 million question. Is there going to be space? Well, the Gulf, as you said, is this powerhouse. It's the center of so many different understandings of the world, center of sort of the tourist exchange, the logistical hub. It's this space where billions of people transit through every day. And the hope is that those billions of people will then stop off, will engage with what is there for them in the UAE, in Qatar, in Saudi, in Oman. You see all these different visions of the future that place tourism very, very central in those visions, be it the Saudi Vision 2030 or Oman Vision 2040. So tourism is seen as a really big thing, but that will of course open up competition between these states. And I think competition is viewed by many of these leaders who've been trained in classical liberal economics. Competition is a good thing, right? It forces you to be more competitive. It forces you to streamline what it is that you're doing in your business models, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's viewed relatively fine. But when it comes to economic investment, there's only so many investors that are going to be able to put in the type of money that is needed. And you look at the Chinese investment, for example, the Saudi level of investment is huge, 44 billion. The Emirati investment, 36. The Iraqi investment is 30. Then it drops off. And when you've got the other GCC states, many of whom are aspiring to a much brighter future. Qatar, of course, is positioning itself incredibly well, but Oman faces all manner of serious challenges and wants to try and get some of that Chinese money. It wants to get more of it. It wants to get more foreign direct investment. And that's where you can potentially see long-standing social tensions between these states. These are states with very rich interwoven histories, be it tribal, be it political, be it conquest. Rich histories that can very easily be cracked open if points of tension emerge.
I mean, and I suppose that if everyone economically is doing well, then that's less likely to happen.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about a challenge that the GCC states and the Middle East. Let's broaden it a bit further, because perhaps some of those countries are more impacted by what we're seeing today. We'll talk about oil prices, but I don't want to get too much into that. Let's talk about the Ukraine war in the context of how it may be impacting the GCC stand, its neutral stand so far towards the war, in the sense that it hasn't joined in terms of the sanctions that have been put on Russia by the US, by Europe, by others in the international community. First of all, what do you make of that neutral stand, and why do you think they're holding that? And then we'll talk a little bit more about how Middle East economies are being impacted by this inflation in commodities and food prices. Well, I'd like to get onto that, but this neutral stand that GCC has taken, why?
Yeah, I think there's two components to it. The first is a reflection of the broader shifting political landscape, notably with relations with the US. I think in the past, pre-Obama, or during the Trump administration, you would have seen a much closer alignment, given the nature of relations between Washington and the Gulf states. So I think that's one. I think the other one, and this is maybe a little speculative, but I think there's also the component that says the Russian argument for invading Ukraine is partly secessionist. It's partly over historical claims to Ukraine, alongside the other claims about denazification and things like that. And if you look at the states that did not condemn the Russian invasion, particularly right at the start, they are all states with secessionist issues. So China over Taiwan, for example, India over Kashmir, and the Emirates over the Greater and the Lesser Tums. So I think what this points to perhaps is a wait and see policy about how the global community will respond to such military incursions addressing those types of territorial questions. So that's another point. And then, of course, there's the argument that, well, they're hedging their bets with regard to Russia.
Yeah, and I mean, one consequence of the Ukraine war has been that oil prices have been held up for longer than even they may have been anyway. We already had oil prices looking very healthy before February, but they're, by all intents and purposes, looking to remain strong and get stronger over the next few months. There doesn't seem to be an end in sight for this war. It may go into a bit of a stalemate, but no one is saying it's going to be over anytime soon. The result of that, of course, one result is that we've got very healthy budgets in the GCC and back in balance and in surplus, lots of money flowing around. So again, the Gulf feels very secure from that point of view. But also we're importing inflation along with the dollar. And that's obviously a concern for the whole world at the moment. And food price inflation, food supply issues, food security, which, as we know, in the Middle East is a huge issue, particularly for countries like Egypt and Lebanon, but also Gulf countries. So do you think that will change in any way the approach of the GCC in its stance towards this war in Europe and trying to influence its end in any way in its geopolitical relationships? Could we see social strife on the streets in the Middle East as a result of inflation and food price inflation in a few months' time?
I wouldn't at all be surprised. I think if we look back at what the conditions were leading up to the Arab uprisings 11 years ago, you can see huge similarities in terms of inflation, in terms of economic inertia, lack of jobs, and food prices dramatically rising. We saw that, of course, in Egypt, and that resulted in the toppling of Hosni Mubarak. Now, I'm not in any way saying that will result in the toppling of Mr. al-Sisi, but the anger is there. Food prices are rising. Egypt imports a huge amount of its wheat. I think it's 90% of its wheat and grain, and approximately 45% comes from Ukraine and Russia. So there are going to be huge shortages, which will, of course, then drive prices up. And when you've got people who are living on or below the poverty line, then that will cause huge social issues. And that's Egypt, which has been relatively stable.
What about here in the Gulf? What kind of impact do you think it'll have?
Well, I think it will continue to drive up inflation. But I think for the Gulf states, the issue is going to be the second order consequences. So how will these issues, these economic issues and these food shortages impact on conflict in Yemen? Well, that's only going to get worse. There's going to be an even larger humanitarian disaster. And so that will prompt calls for Gulf states to do more to help out. The UAE, for example, during COVID, tried to position itself as one of the leading humanitarian states in the world. That was one of the ways it tried to position itself on the world stage. And with a crisis in Yemen, deteriorating, already described by the UN as the worst humanitarian crisis since the Second World War, with huge amounts of grain and wheat not coming into the country, people are starving. And so there will be pressure.
And we've heard some statistics from the World Food Programme in the last week or two, just specifically on Yemen, how their bill there has increased by in the billions. Simon, just one more question to you as we wrap up. Again, a sort of bigger picture question to you. You're director of sectarianism, proxies, and desectarianisation, one of the projects at Lancaster University. Do you see any hope or chance that we will see this sectarianism dissipate in the region because of the economic arguments, again, that we were talking about earlier, that we touched on? Is there, with all these shifts that we're seeing, do you see that as a possibility?
Yes, I do. I firmly believe it's a possibility. It's a bit of a mouthful, so we tend to use SEPAD as an acronym, and the D in SEPAD stands for desectarianisation, which is the reimagining of the way politics is done away from sectarian identities. And we look at Lebanon and Iraq as two really good examples. You see people there trying to push political agendas, political concerns, rather than identity-based concerns, as the way in which politics is done. You look at Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is putting economic issues front and center. Iran will have to put economic issues more and more centrally in its politics and political engagement. So you start to see different ways of doing politics as a consequence of crisis. Now, if these crises, and I talk about crises in the plural because there are many, if they are regulated and handled in an appropriate and sensitive manner, then that desectarianization, the moving away from sect as the dominant factor, the dominant identity marker, can continue in a very positive manner. The problem comes, of course, is if it isn't. If people mismanage things, if people react badly to crises, if they escalate tensions rather than de-escalate, and then that's when we start to see people retreating back to their communal groups when the state is unable to provide them with food, when the state is unable to take care of them, give them food security or basic human security, then people turn elsewhere. And we've seen historically, sectarian groups are able to do that. The leaders of sectarian groups are able to take care of their own. And so when you have a crisis, it's an existential moment. It could go either way, but I'm hopeful.
Well, that's cool. We'll end on that positive note. And therein lies the challenge that we're seeing these economic opportunities, but at the same time, the world has been hit by this inflation and these shifts in relationships, and how all that is managed, obviously, will bring about the outcome. But Simon Mabon, thank you very much, Professor of International Relations at Lancaster University. Thank you so much for your time and insight today on the halftime talk interview. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.